Evening, everybody, and this is an all-new 15 best underrated metal CDs, and this is part 2 of that. I would have called it part 3, but my last video was called 15 more best underrated metal CDs, so here's part 2. First up is Prong and Cleansing from 1994, and this has got Snap Your Fingers, Snap Your Neck. And this is a pretty good CD, and I always thought that this band was pretty underrated. And I know that their guitar player is now with Danzig. Next up, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this band, but this is the debut CD from Fear of God and Within the Veil. And I heard about this band back in '91, and I heard a track from theirs off of Metal Shop back in the early '90s, which is a syndicated radio show, if anybody ever remembers it. And I picked this up a year later in the CD bargain bin over at I think it was a Camelot's or Musicland up in Ashland. Anyway, the band later went independent, and so far this is the only CD I have. I mean, I know that their singer passed away in '97, and this is a pretty good CD. I mean, kind of like a mix of doom and thrash with female vocals. And this next one is a compilation, but I always thought this band was very underrated, and this is of course Godflesh, and I've got 3 of their cassettes. I've got Street Cleaner, which is a pretty good tape, and I've got Pure and Slave State. And of course, their guitar player used to be with Napalm Death, and I always thought this band was very underrated. And next up is German Thrashers Creator with this has got Pleasure to Kill and the Flag of Hate EP on one CD, and I always thought that this band were very underrated. Haven't really heard much from them lately. I don't know if anybody out there is a fan, but this band kicks ass. Next up is Corrosion of Conformity and Wise Blood from '96, and this was their second album for Columbia. And I don't know if this one and Deliverance are out of print, but I know that their first 2 albums on Columbia are now available as an import. Next up is Love, Hate, and Blackout in the Red Room from 1990, and this was one of the better hair metal bands. Back in the '90s, there was still the hair metal scene was still around. I mean, you had bands like Warrant and Slaughter and Trickster, and of course, this wasn't wimpy power metal stuff. This was more in the vein of AC/DC, and I know that their singer had spent some time with LA Guns. Even though this next one's not really metal, they're from Seattle, and it's got a bit of a heavier sound before they got big. And this is Soundgarden with Louder Than Love, and this was what got me into the band. I saw them on video cassette of the old Hard and Heavy video magazine series, if anybody ever remembers them. And this has got a heavier type sound before they got a little bit bigger. And this was when Chris Cornell had long hair. Neurosis with Through Silver and Blood, and I've got all of their albums on Relapse Records, and they were on Relapse Records for about 3 or 4 years, and sadly I've kind of lost interest in them, but I may get around to checking them out again. American Head Charge with The War of Art, and this was their first album for Deaf American or American Recordings, and saw this band on Ozfest back in 2001, and then very ironically a year later I picked this up at my local Sam Goodies when it was still in business. Anyway, I don't know if they're still around or not. They later went independent. Morbid Angel and Covenant from '93, and this was one of two major label albums that they had put out in the early '90s. And of course, if anybody has Night of the Demons 2, the song Rapture is featured in it. And this was produced by Fleming Rasmussen, who had done Metallica's early albums. Clutch with Robot Hive / Exodus. I always thought this band was pretty good. I don't have. This is the only CD I have. Never really followed up on their stuff. I love that song Burning Beard, and the video is pretty cool. Sadly, this is out of print. Cathedral and the Ethereal Mirror from '93, and this of course has Lee Dorian, who used to be in Napalm Death, and big difference from when he was with Napalm Death. I mean, anybody who's ever heard the early Napalm Death knows that Lee Dorian was a screamer, and on this band he kind of sounds like a dying old man. Anyway, this is more in the vein of Sabbath and doom metal. Exodus and Impact is Imminent, and this is one of their two major label bands that they had put out when they were on Capitol in the early '90s, and this is definitely a pretty good thrash metal album. And they followed that up 2 years later with Force of Habit, which was good, but not as good as Impact is Imminent. And these would later be reissued by Caroline Records on CD. And I have featured this band before in my underrated metal CDs video, but to me this band is just completely underrated. And this is of course Voivod, and I mentioned Hatros, and this is their last album for Noise Records. And to me their best albums were on the Noise label, and this has kind of a psychedelic type feel to it, and a little bit of thrash in the mix. And this has got a cover of the Batman theme song to it. Anyway, this is a pretty good CD. And last but not least is a tie, and I'm talking about the last two albums from Pantera. And this is their 1996 CD, The Great Southern Trendkill. And around the same time on this CD, they've got a little bit of mix of death metal on some of the songs. And also around the same time they started doing like one video, and on this one they did the one video which was Drag the Waters. And anyway, this is a pretty good CD. And of course this is their last CD, Reinventing the Steel, which came out in 2000. And they did the one video which was Revolution Is My Name. And saw this band twice. Saw them back in 2000 at Ozfest, and I saw them a year later on the Extreme Steel tour with Slayer, Static X, and they had Morbid Angel and the band called Scrape as support acts. Anyway, I always thought their last two CDs were very underrated. Anyway, that's been it for this video, and I hope you all have enjoyed it. Rock on, guys!